Hello, Justin.
Hello. Hello, Jason. Had to get my my preaching friends. They have different mics and different names for them, and one of them says this is the Garth Brooks mic. So
The Garth Brooks mic. Okay.
is what
Yeah.
he calls it. So
Well, that's good. I think Taylor Swift wears one like it too. So
I would definitely call it a Garth Brooks mic.
all right. There you go. Well, good to be back here once again and tackling once again the book of John. We're kind of into crunch time here, you and me.
Yeah.
Our doesn't feel like it should be, but our time is running short until you leave on the harvest to go down to Texas and start cutting wheat. So plan to leave late next week,
Well,
or next Thursday.
Yeah, next week we're gonna probably take one trip down and then come back.
Okay.
I think. I mean, that's. I just hear what I hear from Boss Man.
From
And
Boss Hog? All right.
You know, we'll go down and take our first trip, and then maybe take the second one the following week or something.
Okay.
We'll just roll with the punches.
There
you know?
you go.
It's about
As
the
long
weather.
As long as you're back on Wednesday night, right, Boss Man? Okay. All right. So our plan is to try to wrap up through John chapter 12, which was where we've always intended to get through with this portion of the study, get through John 12, and then go back and finish Isaiah because we didn't finish Isaiah in the winter. And so we kind of all along planned to have some breaks in there. This one has run longer than we thought it would, but that's okay. It's been a good study, and I've enjoyed it. And it just so happens that we should be able to make that, your departure, coincide with wrapping up John, and then I'll tackle the remainder of Isaiah over the next 13 weeks or so, and we'll see where we're at, and jump back into John later this year. So, John chapter 11, we got started in John chapter 11 last week, and pardon me, my battery's about to die on my computer, which something's not plugged in right then. But it should be. I don't know. If this dies, I'll just have to wing it. Well, hopefully we'll be okay. It shouldn't be on battery power. Okay, so John chapter 11, we looked briefly at the outline last week, and this is the outline we'll follow once again. The overarching story that we're going to look at in this chapter revolves around the death and then the resurrection of Jesus' dear friend Lazarus, and the interaction that Jesus has then with Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, around Lazarus' tomb, as well as the reaction of the other people who were there to witness what takes place, whether they be people who appreciate what happened or be people who don't appreciate what happened. So it's hard to imagine that you could witness somebody being raised from the dead and be mad about it, like be mad that it happened. And yet we see that people do have that reaction. So there's going to be a conspiracy to kill Jesus at the end of the chapter, while others are responding very favorably and trying to find Jesus so that they can interact with him because of what he does. So it's an interesting kind of contrast between those who respond favorably and those who don't. At the beginning of the chapter, we read last week and kind of talked about Jesus is up near, if I can do this over my shoulder, Aenon, which is in this region. We believe, it doesn't say specifically, but it says he was in the area where John had been baptizing, and the last time that we see John baptizing in this area, that's where he was at. So we just kind of make the assumption that Jesus had retreated with his disciples up to that area where they probably were baptizing, and also having some kind of retreat away from people time, because this is going to kind of be the final push towards the cross for Jesus, and he probably had some just some reflection and alone time there as well. So last week we started and got through verse 7, but we're just going to kind of read through that part again and then pick up going section by section tonight. So we'll start in verse 1 and then I'll stop reading at verse 16, and we're on, right? Okay. So now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified for it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. Then this he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us go also, so that we may die with him.
So this first section, Jesus hears and delays. Jesus hears that, we talked about the one that you love is sick. Jesus was very close with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he knows that Lazarus has died. He decides to delay, and after the delay, he says, let's go back to Judea. The disciples are really afraid of this, I guess, if you will, because they say, they were just seeking to stone you, and you want to go back into that place. Bethany is just outside of Jerusalem. And so Jesus is going to go back to the same area in which he just was, and then they were trying to kill him. And we'll see at the end of the chapter, this is when leads right up into John chapter 13, begins the week before the crucifixion. So as a direct result of this journey toward Jerusalem, yes, there will be a time when they get to turn around and go back toward Ephraim, but this is the beginning kind of the end. Jesus' ministry is coming to a close. This is the crucifixion is right around the corner. The Passover is not too far. When the triumphal entry happens, Jesus, meets in the upper room. All of the different stories that will come in John 13 and following is right after this. There's not a lot of time that passes between the departure of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus. And so this is, they are concerned, I would guess rightly would be a good word for putting it, because the sequence of events that follow will end in Jesus' death. But they say, Rabbi, they're going to stone you. Jesus' answer is, are there not 12 hours in the day? Now, the best way I think of thinking of this, and this is just, I wanted to highlight that real quick, but the 12 hours of the day is, in summer, there's 12 hours. In winter, there's only like 8, or sometimes it feels like 6. I mean, there's just no daylight. But in a normal Jewish summer in Israel, there would be 12 hours of daylight in the summer. And so, maybe a little bit beneath the text and beneath of what Jesus is saying, but 12 hours in the day is when light is at one of its strongest. The light is here. The light is fully, the daytime is as much daytime as it's going to get. In the summer, the summer solstice, or whatever you want to call it, at least for us, is in June, when it's the longest day of the year, and it can get up to 13, 14 hours of daylight. But that's when the light is shining its strongest, shining the brightest. And Jesus says, are there now 12 hours in the day? When we're walking in the day, let's walk and do not stumble, because I am shining the brightest at this moment. I think was kind of what he was getting at there, is the light is the strongest, the light is the most it's going to be. Now let's go walk in the light. Then he talks about walking in the night and stumbling because the light is not in him. I think, I wanted to point out maybe that this idea of the light not being in him is what causes him to walk in the darkness. And so when the light of life, the light of the world is in us, we are not walking in darkness, and we are not going to walk in darkness. So he says our friend Lazarus falls asleep, but he's wakened. So I guess we'll talk about that in a second. But so with Jesus, it was never too late. Jesus' timing was perfect. Jesus didn't rush. When Jesus acts, he acts for a purpose. And so we'll get maybe into that a little bit more when we hear some of the responses of Lazarus' sisters. But Jesus, his timing was perfect to bring about the perfect plan of God. Because no doubt Jesus could have healed Lazarus when he was sick. But he intends to wait until Lazarus has died and therefore prove the power of God and make a point and further God's perfect plan. Romans 8:38 says, all things work together for good of those who love the Lord. Well, I mean, Lazarus loves God. Lazarus loves the Lord. He was one of his friends. And so how is it together for good if he dies? And so I think that might be a way of seeing that point in Romans, that even though sometimes death happens, there is still the ultimate good that Jesus, that the plan of God, the will of God is bringing about, and that's what we see Jesus responding to and living within. So Jesus' timing is never late. Jesus delays, he intentionally delays, so that the Son of God may be glorified. It said back in verse 4 that the sickness is not to death, or not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that who? The Son of God. So that I may be glorified over death. So that this precursor to resurrection may glorify me and point to my resurrection in the future. Jesus he intended to show his power over death. That was the purpose. That was the reason. That was the event. And so again, the last thing in verse 16, it says that Thomas says, "Let us go that we may die with him." That can be interpreted a couple of different ways. It could be, well, Lazarus has died, and what's his name? Timothy. Thomas is just being very sympathetic of, let's go so we can die with him. But I think it's more along the lines of pairing verse 16 with verse 8. They think that we're going to go back to Judea and they're going to stone us. And that's what's going to happen. That's the only thing that can result from us going back anywhere near that place, because they want to kill us all. And so on their mind is, we're going back to where this hostile environment. We're out here in this place where John was baptizing. It's somewhat peaceful. There's other people, like-minded people around us. We've got John and his disciples probably even still there. John dies maybe a little later. And so John may still be alive when this is happening. And so, we're here, we're with fellow disciples, we're doing good. Why would you want to go back into this hostile environment? And so I think that is what they're concerned about. But Jesus says, let us go to him, verse 15. And again, one of the things that is really going to be highlighted in this chapter is emotional response to the things going on around us. Jesus says in verse 15 that I am glad. He was glad. We don't necessarily know exactly what that entails, but for me, being glad means, I am rejoicing. I have joy. It is a good thing that I was not there. And so Jesus feels an emotion. That's an emotional word for being glad, being filled with emotion, a positive emotion. And we'll see later that Jesus is filled with a negative emotion, if negative is the right word for it. But he is filled with grief and is weeping at the exact same thing. He says, I am glad that this thing happened. And then later he says, I am so sorrowful that this thing had to happen. And so it is, perfectly reasonable. Even Jesus was sometimes showing two emotions for the same thing. And so if we sometimes get, I know I get caught up sometimes in my emotions and I don't know what's happening. I think it's good, but also I feel a certain way about it. And that's something that even the Lord had to juggle, was emotional turmoil about certain events. But he was still able to rejoice even in this sad situation.
I think you make a couple of great points. One, just relating to that emotional turmoil that Jesus faced here. What was he glad about? He was glad that God's will is going to be accomplished and that God is going to be glorified. And what was he sad about? He was sad about something completely different. So there's two sides to the story. There's one side of the story where he sees his friends hurting. He sees the people around there weeping and wailing because of the loss that they've experienced, and his heart is touched by that. So he's saddened by by that aspect of it. But on the other side of the same issue, he's happy because of God's will being accomplished in that same thing. And I think that might be one of the best definitions of maturity that we can think of when it comes to our own faith, in being able to recognize that there are going to be times when I personally feel away or am hurt or am struggling with something, but then I can see what God is doing. And I can see that through this difficulty or this pain that I'm facing, that God is going to be able to refine me or to strengthen me, or to for His glory to shine through the way that I respond to that. And so even though I'm hurting and I'm facing a difficult time, and I wish I wasn't going through it, but if it results in God's glory, I can be happy about that even in the midst of difficulty. And so that is, what an example of maturity and faith there that Christ gives to His disciples, of being able to show both sides of that. And then the other aspect of it too is, as they think about, they sense that the crowd's trying to kill Him. We came up here to we're away from that difficulty now. We escaped. We got away. And Jesus, you want to go back and put us in that danger again? They completely misread what Jesus did. Jesus wasn't escaping. He just wasn't time yet. When the time was right for Him to die, He was willing to face that. But he was not trying to get away from danger. He was just doing the next thing that He needed to do. And so they kind of misread that part of the scenario where it's time to go back to Jerusalem. And it's like, well, we're going back into danger. Jesus is like, yeah, so? That doesn't matter. And so that goes right back to what Jesus had taught them about: do not fear the one that can kill the body, fear the one that can kill the soul. And so Jesus wasn't scared at all of those that had power of life over Him, life and death. He was more interested in serving the Father, because that's the power of the Spirit. And so that's a good example there for His disciples of practicing what He preached Himself. Verses 17 through 27 here. So when Jesus came, He found that He had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet Him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to Him, I know that He will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to Him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.
Well, alrighty. So we have a little bit of a similarity with, the similar events to today. When someone passes away, usually the people in the countryside will come and give them a bunch of casseroles, and that's great. That's wonderful. That's being a part of the body of Christ. But here it says that many of the Jews came to Mary and Martha to console them concerning their brother. And I think that is a good biblical representation of us trying to be the people of God, of trying to love and show love to other people. So the next couple of slides will have very similar, at least the ones that I put in here that are not in text, will have very similar deals. It says Marley, Martha, and Me. Marley and Me was a movie a long time ago about a dog, about this yellow lab. I don't remember much of the movie. I don't even remember what happens in the movie. But spoiler alert, the dog does not make it all the way to the end of the movie. That is the old Yeller of my day. And again, maybe didn't. But that was the dogs die, and the entire the movie is just a tearjerker. It's just like this dog is so precious and wonderful, and then we have to watch this dog grow up as a puppy, and the struggles of them and their master, and then obedience training and different things, and then at the end the dog passes away. And obviously that's not the same as your brother passing away, but that is a very, at least for me, a very grief-ridden moment that I remember experiencing when I was really, really young. I mean, I don't remember a single thing about the movie other than the dog doesn't make it. And so, Marley, Martha, and Me. I thought that was a funny title slide. I thought it was somewhat clever. I don't know. But this idea of, grief is something that Jesus is responding to. Jesus gets to this place where someone has died. I mean, and someone he loved has died, but these sisters, their brother has died. And so, Jesus, let's see here. Jesus was coming. Martha comes out to meet him. And this was, the first couple verses about Martha. The next couple verses will be about Mary. But this is Martha, and me. And so Martha asked this question. She said, Lord, she doesn't ask a question, but she states this. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The implied statement, the implicit question that isn't asked is, why were you not here? Where were you, Lord? I know you have the power, and that's what she says next she says, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. If you had been here, this was her way of saying it, you could have asked God, and my brother would have lived. He would have kicked the illness and been able to be well again, but he has died. And so Jesus is going into this grief-ridden area, this grief-ridden place, and this is what he does. This is his response. She said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said, your brother will rise again. When met with Martha's grief, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Now, I don't know necessarily if you would call that doctrine, but that is kind of what he starts with. He starts trying to bring up the teachings that she already knows. Because she responds to him and says, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And so Jesus starts this dialogue and starts asking her about these teachings, about the things that she knows, and going through this mental process with her of, your brother's gonna live again someday. And again, right now it's pointed toward the future. But I know that he will rise again in the last day. And Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And so Jesus continues this dialogue of encountering Jesus encountered her grief and how he dealt with it. His response was to continue to engage with her on the things that she knows, the teachings that she has about Jesus, and the different things that are going on in her mind. Jesus doesn't rebuke their grief, even when they say, if you were not here, they wouldn't have died. And so, again, what I take from that is grief is not something to be avoided. It is not something that we need to run from. Even as Christians, we're still able to experience and live through and live out and express, that's where I was going, express our grief in God-honoring ways. But we are allowed to express our grief, and Jesus allows them to do this, and he responds to them, responds to Martha by talking with her through about these great things that will happen one day. Just remember, and that is a great thing when someone's loved one has died, you will see them again. They have the resurrection and the life as their Savior. They will live again, and you will see them again. And that is comforting, and that is wonderful, and that is something that we can do and say to help people when they are struggling with grief. But that's not the only way. That is not even necessarily the model that we should always use with different people, because that's not the model that Jesus even uses with Mary, as we will see here in his next couple verses.
I like what you said about Jesus. He honors their grief, but Jesus has a different perspective on the grief. And when you're in the moment of that grief, it's hard to imagine there's anything bigger than that grief. I mean, that grief is all that there is in your life. That grief is all that you feel. And it's all that you can acknowledge in that moment. And Jesus gently and is able to redirect, if you will, Martha towards a bigger purpose, a bigger cause that Jesus can see and he can understand. So even in the midst of honoring her grief, he still is directing the conversation towards something that is bigger than her grief in that moment. And that's hard for us to accept. And I'm not Jesus, and I would never try to do that to somebody in the midst of their grief. Try to tell them, take a step back from the way you're feeling in the moment and think about the bigger picture. I don't think that's the approach we should take to people who are in grief, but Jesus is able to do that and sort of get Martha thinking about something bigger than how she feels in that moment. And that's difficult to do. But Jesus did a lot of hard things. So moving along. Verses 28, 29, verses 28 to 37. This is where we're going, it looks like. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying, secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind man, have kept this man also from dying?
So Mary and me. She asked similar questions. She starts the conversation similarly. But notice where Jesus was. Jesus was trying to relate with these women. And it says that he had not yet gone into the village. He was still, and maybe this is reading a little too far into the text, but he was trying to have a conversation with Mary. It says that, Martha went and said, the teacher is calling. And so Jesus was trying to have a relationship outside of the public view. Now, I think on one hand, it might be about Jesus didn't want to go into the village and then the Pharisees get wind that he's here, let's go kill him now, and totally, I wouldn't say ruin what is about to happen, but intervene into this wonderful miracle that he's about to perform. But I think on the other hand, he's also trying to confront their grief in a personal way, in a way that makes sense to them, and to continue to have a relationship with him. And so, she asked the exact same question. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you, Lord? And I think we sometimes ask the same questions. But notice what Jesus does. His response to Mary's grief is different than it was to Martha. Jesus doesn't ask doctrinal questions. He doesn't ask, do you believe these statements about the resurrection and life? He doesn't further his teaching. He doesn't tell her that everything's going to be okay, that you're going to see Lazarus again someday. What Jesus does is he sits with her and feels with her and it grieves with her. And if we may go a step forward, he grieves for her. He grieves for this situation. That Jesus knows he's about to resurrect this man back from the dead. He's about to, in a sense, terminate their grief. The reason they are sorrowful is their brother has died. And Jesus is about to turn that completely around. Their brother's going to be back. But Jesus still, in that moment, says, you know what? The grief and the pain of death is something that I will grieve at here too. The sorrow that I see my friends going through, sorrow is sorrowful to me. And so I think on one hand, the realities of death, the sorrows, the grief, and the pain that comes from that is something that Jesus is recognizing and saying, this is terrible. Now I'm about to undo all of this, but this is terrible, and I want to sit here and respond to Mary's grief. And so what that says to me is that there is not one method of dealing with grief among people who are going through grief and grieving themselves. And there is not even necessarily one method for those who are trying to help people grieve. Because sometimes, and I think I learned maybe a little bit too much about this in one of my pastoral care and counseling classes. And it was a counseling class meant specifically for, preachers that aren't going to be counselors and have... It's just a class about learning how to be a shade tree counselor as you're trying to, help people with their life, and saying that, grief is something that should be lived through and experienced. And when you start trying to make one mold of, well, what we really need to do is just sit and listen to someone talk and just let them get it off their chest and talk to them about doctrinal things, well, the Martha approach may not work for when there's a Mary in front of you who just needs someone to just sit there in silence and cry with you. And so there is not one response that is appropriate for grieving, and there's not one response that is necessarily appropriate for those who are trying to help people who are grieving. And so let's not get too stuck in one way or the other. And well, when people are grieving, we just need to tell them about Jesus and tell them that we're going to see them again someday, and it's going to be so well, and teach them about these doctrinal things, because sometimes what they need is someone to sit there and weep with them. And I think this passage is teaching us that there is a way. There are two different people here, two different grieving strategies, two different grieving responses. And so, let's be cautious in the way that we approach people who are grieving.
Amen. I appreciate all of that. That's a good application of this text. Grief is hard. Verses 38 to 44. So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go."
So, we saw earlier the what do you call that? The onrushing of the casseroles. It's something that we still do similar to today when people are grieving. And here we see something on the total opposite of the spectrum. This is not something that we do today. When we bury someone, we have lots of embalming fluids and in different ways that we preserve the body. And the last time that we see the body, they look as lively as they can make them. They have the makeup on, they have their best suit or dress or whatever on. They're laying peacefully. And in the old days, the practice was wrap them in some spices so they don't stink very much. And they didn't have a whole lot of embalming methods that they would have gone through. And again, there might be some more that we can unearth from archaeology and things, but they did not have the same process that we do. It was something totally different. And so, when Martha says, "Oh, there will be a stench," KJV, "he will stinketh." This was a body that had deteriorated. Now, I don't know how often you guys are dealing with dead things, maybe on things on the side of the road, but when cows die, we have a cow graveyard that they go to, and boy howdy, that place is disgusting. And so there is a little bit of, I have some fond memories, not fond at all, but just, I can smell that stench. It wasn't human bodies, but the cow bodies have decayed. It's like you can just, the smell is wafting out of the tomb as they roll the stone back. And it doesn't even necessarily, let's see here. So they removed the stone, and then Jesus raised his eyes and said this prayer. So this prayer was happening while the stench of the tomb was rolling out. And Lazarus has still not been resurrected. I was going to say revived. He hasn't been resurrected yet. And so Jesus is praying as the stench is just coming out of the cave. And he says this prayer. And notice that he says this prayer and why he says this prayer. "I know, God, that you are always hearing me, but I say this because of the people." Verse 42. Because of the people. The prayer for the people. Because they need to see that you and I are one, and that you and I are together. And that this resurrection is coming by the power of you, by the power from God, and it is working through me. And this is precursor to my resurrection. So, how can Jesus resurrect someone from the dead? Why can Jesus resurrect someone from the dead? Because he is the life. It's not something necessarily that he does. It is not something that, let's rephrase this. How can he bring Lazarus back to life? It is not because he can do it, but because he is it. He is life. And so because he is life, it overflows from him, and he is able to have the power over life to bring him back to death and bring him back to life and give him life. So he is the life. He is the resurrection. And so he says, Lazarus, come out. There's an old preacher joke that says, why do we have to say Lazarus, come out? Well, because if he just said come out, the whole graveyard would have emptied. But on the other hand, Lazarus, I think one of the things about this is, Jesus knows his sheep by their own name. He knows each by his own name. He knows us by our own name. Now, this next part is kind of going to segue, I guess, metaphor into the spiritual resurrection that we all enjoy. Now, there are lots of different resurrections if you want to talk about in the Bible. There's the resurrection of the last day. And there's the resurrection from the dead, specifically that people saw and witnessed, the resurrection from the dead of Lazarus, the widow's son at Nain. There's this nobleman's daughter that has died, that he raises from the dead. There are people that are physically dead that he brings back to life. That is one type of resurrection. There's another type of resurrection that people who are physically dead will be resurrected on the last day to a spiritual body. And so there's a second type of resurrection, the physical body to a spiritual body. But there is a spiritual to spiritual resurrection that we all enjoy. The resurrection from dead to sin to alive in God that Paul will talk about in Galatians and Romans. But when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, what he is saying is, I am calling you out of death and into life. And that is exactly what Jesus does for each and every one of us. He has said, Jason, come out of death into life. He has said, Jim, come out of death and into life. He said, Cindy and Tracy and every single person here, come out of your death and come into life. And when we are raised to walk in that newness of life, Jesus has some things. He says some things to us. And I think this is a good metaphor to take. What does Jesus say when Lazarus comes out? He says, unbind him, because he has the linen, the death strips that have tied around him. Unbind him from those things and leave the things of death with the tomb. The things of your old life, your old self, and put it back in the tomb and let him go free and act differently. You were dead and now you're alive. And so what should we do when we are resurrected with the sin of our old life? The sin that belongs to death, the sin that so easily entangles us, that is wrapped around us like those linens. Hebrews 12 will talk about what we do with every sin that so easily entangles us. We cast them aside. We unbind them. We take off the things of death and set them aside. And we no longer walk and try to keep those things wrapped around us, because that would be disgusting. We talked about the stench earlier. It's all over those things. And if Lazarus just walked about his life with those things wrapped around him, he would still smell really bad. And so Jesus says, take off those things. Take off the old self. Take off the sin, the gross things, and walk in newness of life. And so we will walk, we will live, we will move, we will do and go in a life-giving pattern instead of going like we were still dead. And so Jesus says, unbind him and let him go.
That's good stuff. And the only thought I have to add to that ties two things together. Jesus is the resurrection and life. And so when Jesus calls us out of death into life, he calls us into himself, because he is the life. And so that's a neat, visual image to think about. It's not calling us out of death into a life over there. It's into him. And so we're actually, as many of you have been baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself with Christ. We are made alive in him.
Before we move on, I titled that slide, The Beginning of the End for Death, because Jesus has shown his power over death, and this is the beginning of the end. As we read again, John chapter 13 to like John 23 is a very long section, but it's 1 week, and then the crucifixion will happen. So this is the beginning of the end. Someone has been resurrected from death and has shown that death has no power. And soon the death will be at a complete end, and Jesus will overcome and conquer.
Verses 45 through 54 is where we're going to end up here. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples.
So this slide was titled "The Beginning of the End" for Jesus, or rather, really, Jesus' ministry is coming to an end. This is the beginning of the ending, because Jesus will raise Lazarus from the dead, and there are people that don't like it, and they will even try to reverse Jesus' life-giving power by trying to kill Lazarus. It's rather interesting. In chapter 12, there will be a manhunt, if you will, so that they were going to call for the death of Lazarus. But the beginning of the end for Jesus, because this is when they have made their plans, they have made their traps, and they are going to continue to follow through with it. I mean, not that they haven't been serious about killing him like the other 4 times they've tried to stone him, but now they are intending on doing that, and they're going to use the Passover as one of the traps to do that. And so it's interesting, John is recording this, and he's recording it as this. The chief priests and the Pharisees believed that he was doing signs. They could not dispute the signs. And John has been writing about these 7 signs that Jesus has done. And so they could not refute the signs, and therefore they tried to kill the messenger. And so, again, they try to kill him. One of the things that, Caiaphas has prophesied, that one man would die so that the whole nation would not perish. Now, if you think about it physically, that's, let's put it on one hand. On physically, if Jesus were a false teacher and they were able to put him to death, that would be a great thing for the people of God. There was this person that was leading our sheep astray, leading them into the wilderness, and we are bringing them back to God. And so that's what Caiaphas thought he was doing in some misguided sense, shape, or form, because they were self-righteous. They thought themselves so right. But that is, if you want to place them in a very, look at the best possible way they could have been thinking about this. Well, Jesus was a false teacher, false prophet, leading the people of Israel astray. So we need to take down his message so that people are not led astray anymore. And then they say that one man is going to die so that the whole nation can be brought back to God. And so, again, that the nation is going to be brought back, but that he, who is God, that God might be able to gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And if you look at this from the spiritual standpoint, Caiaphas is exactly right. Caiaphas is exactly right. Now, Jesus is not a false prophet. The motives are totally wrong, but here's exactly what it says. It says that Jesus was going to die for the nation. Now, Romans, there's some difficult passages to wade through, but Romans 10 talks about how all Israel, we are now, those who follow Jesus, are part of Israel, part of the one nation. That those who are scattered abroad are gathered together under Jesus. And so you see this prophecy that, this evil leader prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation because he needed, in their mind, he needed to die because he was a false teacher, and the nation would be spared from his false teaching. But on the other hand, John and Jesus will use this prophecy and say, one man did need to die for the nation of Israel, spiritual Israel, to be saved. And also that God was going to gather into one those who were scattered, even Gentiles. And so, again, when I first read that, I was like, well, that's kind of odd that John included this prophecy that Jesus was going to die. And on one hand, the physical side came first, in my mind, but that spiritual reality that God is going to have Jesus die for the nation, that God is going to gather those who are scattered, was I think a beautiful part that they were using this prophecy for a better and more holy use. So verse 54, Jesus could no longer continue to walk publicly among the Jews, but he went away from there to the country near the wilderness. So Jesus can no longer walk openly, and that is, again, a sign that bad things, the crucifixion is coming. And we will see in verse 55 that it gets even more intense. The story continues. The plot thickens.
Yeah, and it fits right in with what Jesus had already. I mean, he's been telling them these things all along. First of all, back in chapter 10, when he said that there are other sheep, in verse 16, there are other sheep of this, which are not of this fold. I must bring them in also. They will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I laid out my life that I might take it again. And so, I mean, this just fits exactly. Caiaphas is making Jesus' plan come true. And it always, I mean, the whole conversation that John records, or the line of reasoning that they use, has always just befuddled me, because, we see that he is performing many signs, which that word means attesting miracles that specifically are for the purpose and designed to approve the word that he speaks. And so they attest to who he is. That's the word that Caiaphas uses to describe the things that Jesus is doing. He's not just preaching about who he is, he's performing signs to prove to us who he is. So we better kill him. We better kill the guy that just raised someone from the dead. He's just proven that he is the power of life over death, and our response is to kill him. Their logic is lacking, but they are going to move forward with that plan anyway. And so it's just always been a conundrum to me that they come up with this crazy plan. 55 through the end of the chapter here. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. So they were seeking for Jesus, and were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it, so that they might seize him.
So the trap for Jesus is set. During the Passover, Jews would gather at the temple. They would all come to Jerusalem. That was their pilgrimage kind of a thing. They would come and gather. And so, this has some implications beyond just what we are reading here at the end of this chapter. One of the implications is Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem. So a vast majority of Jews who are on their way traveling into Jerusalem will have heard, this man has died and now he's alive. And they would have heard, well, wow, how did that happen? With Jesus, and Jesus was performing these signs and miracles. And then on the other hand, the Pharisees are, and it said that they had given orders that if anyone knew where Jesus was, they were to report it. And so they would know these two conflicting ideas, that they're coming into the city for Passover, and they probably have heard from the different feasts that they had come into the city, again, about this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, and how they've been trying to stone him and kill him and do all these different things. And so they come in hearing that Jesus has resurrected someone from the dead, and the Pharisees are still trying to kill him. And on the other hand, if Jesus was going to attend the Passover, they have the perfect trap. Well, if he doesn't come to the Passover, he must not have been a good Jew. He must not have been a faithful Jew to not come for the Passover. But on the other hand, well, if he comes to the Passover, we're going to bang bang. I guess they didn't have guns. But they were going to seize him and capture him, and we will see that eventually that's what happens. On my computer, when I try to put it in there, those two little dashy lines were together. But John 11, at the very beginning, is about Jesus giving life to a dead man. And the prophecy at the end of John 11 is about Jesus giving his own life for dead men. And, maybe that's a cool way of remembering John 11. I don't know. I try to think of fun, clever things, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It takes me a little bit. Sometimes we need a village to help us. The W, anyways.
It's good. The whole... if John 11 ends with the raising of Lazarus, and that's where the story ends. I mean, it ends right there, and we know nothing else. It's a pretty cool story, but so what? But because that story leads to what happens in the pages that follow, that's what gives meaning to the resurrection of Lazarus. That's why it means something, other than just being a cool story. So I like that connection there. All right, so we made it through a chapter. Let's look at a couple of takeaways here. If we look at, and actually I'm going to go back to verse 5, verse 4, and then 15, 40, and 42 kind of ties a theme that goes through the chapter there. Verse 4 says, but when Jesus heard it, heard that Lazarus was sick, Jesus said, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. And then verse 15, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And then verse 40, Jesus said, or did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And verse 42, when he prayed, and I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people standing around, I said it, that they may believe that thou didst send me. So this connection between the big picture of what's going on here. The people that were around the tomb of Lazarus were lost in their grief. They were focused on the weight of that grief, and they couldn't imagine that there was anything bigger than that moment. But Jesus sees a much bigger picture, and through the details of that story that are unraveling, as we see them on the page, we see God's glory really come to the forefront. But think about the people that were there that missed it. They didn't see God's glory in what Jesus did. Because what did some of the people do? Many believed in him, but some went and did what? Reported to the Pharisees. They went and told on him. They were tattletales. Oh, you should have seen what this guy Jesus came and did. Lazarus was in the tomb. He was dead 4 days. And Jesus raised him. Can you believe he did that? I mean, they missed it. They saw it. They called it an attesting miracle. And so they see this wonderful miracle performed, and they missed God's glory in the miracle. And so the question then today is what does it mean for us to see God's glory? How do we experience God's glory? What do we experience so that God's glory comes to the forefront? And how do we miss it? Are there times when we miss it, and how do we miss it? Teresa?
Seeing how he can change our lives.
Right.
I mean, I always remember when I was just wishing I could start over again, and you can't go back and be born again, and who's to say even if you could that things wouldn't have been the same.
Right.
But in Christ, my slate was wiped clean, and that is God's glory.
That is. That he can do for us what we can never do for ourselves.
Ever.
And you're right, if we could go back, we all have things, man, if I could go back and redo this or relive this, I would do something different. Yeah, but we'd mess it up again. I mean, we might do something different, but would we do it any better?
Right.
And we would still mess it up. But by the power of God, we don't have to go back to redo it. We can start fresh where we are. And that's the story of Lazarus, that he is raised to a new life. And he is raised in Christ. So that is a beautiful thing.
I think that I would describe, the glory of God as something objectively subjective. It is objective that it is there, that God is, that the glory of God is alive, it is powerful, it is huge, that God deserves glory, and that, in this we see that the glory of God was made manifest in Jesus and in what he was doing. And so some people missed the glory of God, and some people saw the glory of God. And so what does that mean for us today is we need to pursue and actively reason ourselves to see God's glory around us. Because, again, we can be either on autopilot or stuck in our own little bubble and our own ideas and thoughts and what we think should and shouldn't happen and all these different deals, that we miss the glory of God. But if we can live our lives with an open mind to seeing and being to recognize that the glory of God is all around us, it just takes us to acknowledge and then worship God for his glory around us.
I think that's a great point. The glory of God is there, and if we don't see it, it's not because it's not there. It's because we have missed it, or we've been distracted, or we have been we're looking elsewhere or something. So I think I appreciate that point a lot, and that reflects what Jesus said in his prayer to God. I knew that you heard me, but thank you for allowing me the opportunity to show it to the people around me because they weren't seeing it. I knew it was here already. Jesus was already there, but everybody else needed to see the miracle so that they could have the opportunity to be where Jesus was. And many of them saw it, many of them caught up with Jesus in that moment, but many of them didn't. So Jesus saw that glory and he knew it was there, and we've got to train ourselves to see it as well. For me, the final thoughts here, the key words are believe, life, and resurrection. Read through that chapter, and I mean, the word believe is such a key word in John, but there are certain places, and this chapter is one of them for me, that, go through and underline the word believe and see how important that idea is in this chapter. And of course, that belief centers around the idea of life and resurrection. That's what this miracle was for, so that people can believe. This, I think, almost inarguably is Jesus' greatest miracle, if you don't count his own resurrection, because I think that one, that one's, that one doesn't count, because it's the one. But other than miracles that he did for other people or to other people or whatever, this one is the greatest. And everything that Jesus has done, at least in the book of John, leads up to this. Everything is guiding us to this point because of the way John structures his book and the reason that he's writing. This is like the pinnacle of those 7 signs that we've seen, and then we're going to have one more when Jesus is raised from the dead. That's like the 8th one, which is the kind of the extra. But as far as like things that Jesus does to others or for others or in other situations, this is the pinnacle. And so, and in this whole story, Jesus' perfect obedience is on full display. We can't. The foolishness of the response of the Pharisees is on full display in contrast to Jesus' perfect obedience. And it's always been that way, but this miracle really highlights that. Their response to that really just shows how incredibly blind they are to what Jesus is doing, who he is.
So, in our negative 3 minutes, here's my final thoughts. Grief is normal. Grief is different for each person. As we are brothers and sisters trying to help each other through grief and trying times, be cognizant, be careful with how we talk with one another and what we are doing. Sometimes it works for some people and not for others, and don't think that, well, it worked for me, I have the best way, I have the method, and if you don't get over it as fast as I did, well, you just didn't do it right. Be compassionate towards people who are going through grief. Jesus has the power over death. I believe that's exactly what this miracle is about. The leaders cannot dispute his signs. They do not like his message, and they say he's even doing message sealing, I don't know, the seal of the king, verifying, message verifying miracles, but we don't like his message, so we're going to kill him. The final thought is every human being lives forever. Every single person lives forever. I mean, there is a time we will have physical death, but every single person who has existed and will exist will live forever. And so we should be cognizant of the fact that Jesus is the resurrection and life, and there's only life forever through him. There is a death forever without him.
Final point, I like it when there's nobody to ring the bells.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.